Shana Tova. We were ending summer, as we always do, on a family vacation, taking advantage of the last seconds of break before heading back to school. This time, road tripping through New England to Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, before ending with a weekend visit to my wife's family in Boston. With 3 kids, there were only a few visits to urgent care, so we'll take that as a win. We woke up early on that Sunday of Labor Day weekend. It was my wife Andrea's birthday, for a couple of moments of quiet celebration together. The birthday joy for us soon turned to tears as we received word from the evening before that 6 Israeli hostages still held in captivity in Gaza were murdered. Among them, our dear friend Hirsch Goldberg-Polin. Hirsch was one of the hostages taken from the Nova Music Festival on October 7th. His arm having been blown off by a grenade that Hamas threw into the bomb shelter where he and dozens of others sought refuge in. We often spoke of peace. Like me, Hirsch was a peacenik, with a sign in his bedroom that read in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, "Jerusalem is for everyone." And we talked about sports. Well, I loved and love my Baltimore Orioles. There's always next year. He was a diehard fan of Hapoel Yerushalayim, the Jerusalem soccer team, and had their scarves and banners on his bedroom walls. Such a fan that their jerseys this season pay tribute to him. I remember when he worked at Camp Ramah Darom in the mountains of Georgia, and would often be seen on the reshed helping campers climb up the spiderweb net ladder as part of the high ropes course. We talk about our love of music, going to concerts, and during this past year, I felt like I was checking in with his parents, John and Rachel, almost daily to see how they were doing. They'd remind me, as we all knew, how many days it had been since our friend Hirsch had been taken. And they spoke about their resiliency and determination, how they continue to stay strong, and what I could do to help. They shared about how neighbors would constantly be in and out of their home, located right near Canyon Hadar, the neighborhood shopping mall that we would frequent when we lived in Jerusalem, where we'd go to see a movie on a Saturday night, or stop by the discount supermarkets to buy food for Shabbat. The neighborhood was lifting them up and supporting them. The news of Hirsch's death hit us especially hard because we knew him, because we loved him. In announcing his death, his family referred to him as a Yeled Shel Or Ahava V'Shalom, a child of light, of love, of peace. The truth is, though, I never met Hirsch, or John, or Rachel. I never met his sisters, Libby and Orly. I didn't know him when he worked at Camp Ramah, and I've never been to his home, even if it was, in fact, blocks from where we used to live. We never went to concerts together. We never traveled the globe. But I knew him. The Hebrew word yada in Torah means more than just to know. It means to know someone intimately. We'll often use to describe cohabitating or intercourse. Ramban notes that it's meant to refer to a closeness among people. In fact, it's the same word used describing the Jewish people's relationship with God, da ifnei me'ata omed. I did not know Hirsch Goldberg Polin, and I do not know his family. And yet, I do feel like I knew him so intimately. It feels odd to know someone so well, to feel so deeply connected to someone, to a person, to a family that I've never spoken to, that I've never met. But like so many throughout the world, I've grown to know this family and love them. Hirsch became the face of the Bring Them Home movement. As an Israeli American, his parents, like so many families of hostages, traveled the world, doing all that they could, meeting with countless world leaders to try and bring him home safely. Just days before we got word that he was among 6 hostages murdered by Hamas, John and Rachel, his parents, spoke at the Democratic National Convention, urging our country's leaders to prioritize freeing their son and these hostages. And even during Shiva, when they were mourning and grieving, when we were all mourning and grieving, they paused to urge the world to do whatever they could to make sure that the 101 hostages who remain in captivity come home. The following week, at his weekly address from the balcony of the Vatican, even Pope Francis made mention of Hirsch and prayed. I think of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, he said, who was found dead in September with 5 other hostages in Gaza. In November last year, the Pope said, I met his mother, Rachel, whose humanity struck me, and I accompany her at this time. I pray for the victims and continue to be close to the families of all the hostages, Pope Francis said. We're approaching the Yartzites, the first anniversary of October 7th. We'll observe this mournful day on Sunday here as a community at Bethel and come together with the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West community on Monday nights. I've been filled with pain and heartache since October 7th, not just as we mourn the 1,200 murder that day, not just as we struggle with the unimaginable loss, the results of a year of war, but for me, as we painfully and painstakingly wait for hostages to be freed. Each and every Shabbat this year, we've shared a story of a hostage and prayed for them to be released. For Judaism teaches that Pidyon Shvuim, the redeeming of those in captivity, is a mitzvah rabbah, the most important of our commandments. Rambam goes on to suggest that being held hostage is even worse than death. I keep coming back, though, to that September 1st morning, beginning the day in tears, feeling so connected to Hirsch, trying to find joy in celebrating my wife's birthday, while being so sad. Having trouble being happy with family, being so sad over the loss of someone I didn't know, someone who I knew deeply in my heart but never met. In the words of Dr. Michal Biton, the pain that I felt is peoplehood. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the prominent rabbinic voice in the American Orthodox Jewish community throughout much of the 20th century, spoke in a 1965 sermon about peoplehood. He was asked whether the Jewish people living spread out throughout the diaspora, throughout the world, with different languages and cultures and traditions and rituals, has caused us to cease being a single people, no longer one large community, if we ever were. Essentially, he asked, are we still we? He answers this question with an odd text from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Menachot, which speaks of a person born with two heads. The Talmud asks if that individual should be considered one person or two, wear two sets of tefillin, receive two portions of inheritance, etc. Rabbi Soloveitchik suggests that the way to conclude if this was one individual or two is to pour boiling water on one of the heads. If the other head, he says, screams in pain, then they are a single entity. He concludes, so long as there is shared suffering, there is unity. Or as Dr. Michal Biton puts it, that pain that we feel reminds us that we are still we. Feeling that pain also causes us to see the world differently. And depending on whose pain resonates with us or how we feel that pain, we respond differently. For example, in this morning's Torah reading, Hagar was kicked out of Abraham's home along with his firstborn son, Ishmael. When Hagar had no water left to give her son, she placed him in the bushes in the wilderness. And then he cried out, and God heard Ishmael's cries. The text says that when Hagar placed Ishmael within that bush, he was only a yeled, only a child. But when he cried out and God heard his cries, he was a na'ar, a young adult. Experiencing pain caused him to grow up faster than he normally would have. It caused him to see the world differently. So too, through our pain, through experiencing the pain and suffering of others, we've been forced to see this world differently than we had before. 10 years ago, during my first high holidays here at Congregation Bethel, I spoke about Israel. Only weeks after Israel's 2014 summer war in Gaza. Then I cited an article that's now a decade old from the New York Times, which it published just before Rosh Hashanah, suggesting how hesitant rabbis were at that time to discuss Israel during the high holidays. A decade ago, the Times noted that Israel had become contentious, and sadly, it had driven people away from the organized Jewish community, suggesting that rabbis said even being balanced or centrist, they feared, was fraught with danger. That was 10 years ago. You can only imagine what the article might say today. But what I choose to focus on is not war, is not policy, is not history, is not strategy. I focus on people. For it's ultimately our relationship with the people of Israel that unites us. It's our relationship as Jews that intrinsically link us together. And as we prepare to mark the one-year anniversary of October 7th, a year marked with war and mourning, with fear and uncertainty, a year marked with too much loss of life, we can't ignore the pain, the exhaustion, the anxiety, the determination, and the grief of peoplehood. So it's people, our family, our siblings, those who we feel like we know even though we've never met them, that I choose to focus on. I'm not suggesting that we do not feel other people's pain as well, for that too is what it means to be human. And I'm not suggesting that we do not seek to see all of humanity as made in God's image. After all, Hillel famously teaches us both im einani li mili and uchsha'ani latzmi ma'ani. Teaches us both that if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? Hillel demands that we care both about ourselves and others. But ultimately, there's an order to his teaching. He acknowledges that first, im einani li mili. First, we must remember that if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Before we can be reminded that if I'm only for myself, what am I? Im einani li mili has to come first. In the same way we're taught on airplanes to put on our oxygen mask before we help another. It's justifiable to prioritize our own pain and heartache. That doesn't mean that we ignore the pain of others. What it means, though, is to paraphrase the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, that if there's to be peace in the world, there must first be peace in the home and peace in our hearts. Feeling the pain of another is peoplehood, and feeling the pain of community is also peoplehood. I felt the pain of this community this past year as well. We're taught in Masechet Shvuot in the Babylonian Talmud, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh, that every member of the Jewish community is responsible for one another. We were all at the foot of Sinai, from our ancestors to our descendants. We all left Egypt. We all wandered in the wilderness, and we all entered the promised land. That does not mean we all agree. In fact, we joke often that where there are two Jews, there are three opinions. I think about the Tannaitic voices of Hillel and Shammai. They were quite different. One lenient, the other strict. One gentle, the other more direct. They disagreed in almost all areas, but were able to resolve all but three of their disagreements because they learned together. They were essentially chavruta, learning partners, each other's teachers, but they were also willing to be each other's students. Their students, though, the schools of Hillel and Shammai, disagreed hundreds of times. They weren't interested in being in community together. They focused on their disagreements, that which divided them rather than that which united them. They forgot that they were part of something larger than themselves. Community is peoplehood. It's understanding that we're a part of something larger than ourselves. It means we're there for each other, that we care for each other, even in disagreement. We're taught that a bris or a wedding is traditionally followed by a sudat mitzvah, not a party, not a celebration, but a community celebratory meal, for it's the obligation of the entire community to celebrate. And when one is in mourning, we're required to say Kaddish with a minyan, a quorum of at least 10 because we cannot grieve alone. We jokingly say that one cannot be a Jew on a deserted island because Judaism is about so much more than ritual or practice or theology or prayer. It's about community. And that is peoplehood. Peoplehood doesn't mean we agree or share the same vision, but it means that we're family. It means that when one of us is happy, we celebrate joy, and it means that when one of us is in pain, we feel that pain. So when we've shared about each hostage every Shabbat this past year, and when we've prayed for their safe return, it was about peoplehood. It was about understanding and feeling the pain of another as our own. And so too, this moment, this space, is about peoplehood. I sit in this sanctuary every year about an hour before Rosh Hashanah begins with a simultaneous sense of fear and awe, wondering how our tefillot will fill up this cavernous space, wondering if God's presence will fill this space just as God filled up the Mishkan. But now I stand here at this moment with this sanctuary filled to capacity, with some sitting squished together in the back, or standing in the back. Sorry, there are seats open in the front. And I know now how God's presence fills this space. God fills this space when we do. For community is what makes Judaism more than faith. It's about people. It's about people in our pain and in our joy. It's about people in our prayers. It's about people in our hope for better news, for a better year, for a better future. Orna Nutra, the mother of Israeli-American hostage Omer Nutra, again, someone who I also feel like I know so deeply, even though we've never met, called Rachel Goldberg-Polin to express condolences after she heard the news about Hirsch. And on the phone, she told Rachel that after she heard the news of Hirsch's death, she had given up hope that Omer will return home safely. But Rachel, even in the midst of her own grief, told Orna that hope is mandatory. As Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg teaches, hope is the greatest gift the Jewish people have given the world, and hope is how we've survived for so long. Even in her own grief, she's giving hope to another. For that too is peoplehood. This new year is filled with much uncertainty, but I hope that in the new year we can turn to each other in joy and turn to each other in sorrow. Turn to each other even when we disagree. Mishnah tells us that we don't separate ourselves from community. We're together, and it's together that we find purpose. Together, we're reminded that we're part of something larger than ourselves. Together, reciting the same words of liturgy in unison all throughout the world, we're reminded of the power of peoplehood. May we find strength and fortitude in that peoplehood. For it was Rashi, the famous 11th century French biblical commentator, who famously notes that when the Israelites stood at the foot of Sinai, in that moment, we were not hundreds of thousands, we were one. Rashi says, we did so as one people with one heart. Despite our diversity or differences, or better yet, in celebrating that, may we still move forward in the year ahead, just as Rashi proclaims, as one people with one heart. Because that is peoplehood. Shana Tova.